So I'm only going to give very brief introductions because the biographies and descriptions of the artist projects are in the show and also in the exhibition materials. So why don't we start with the presentation of Subhankar Banerjee, and that will be followed with Ursula Biemann and then the Otolith group, and we'll have then a discussion with all three participants.
I feel really deeply grateful and humbled to be part of this family and the conversations we are having here right now. Thanks to TJ, Alex, Irene, and all the staff members of the museum for making this reality, the conference and the exhibition. For the past 15 years, I have been deeply engaged with issues in the Arctic. And as many of you know, that the Arctic is warming at a rate of average 2 to 3 times more than the global average. And in the winter time, it's even more than that. And clearly a disintegrated Arctic would not only be a threat to the ecology and the human communities of the but a threat to the whole planet Earth. But there is a paradox there, and the paradox is this: the very climate change that is melting the Arctic is at the same time opening up the region to further resource extraction. And all of the Arctic nation states are going gung-ho about extracting these natural resources and turning the whole region into a potential future industrial wasteland. But I won't really go into in my presentation about that. In fact, what I'm going to do is not talk about climate change at all, but specifically address the topic of this conference, which is rights of nature. And some of the conversation we were having just right before this will very nicely and easily go into some of the things. Hopefully, I'll be able to respond to some of the questions that got brought up earlier this morning. And in fact, what I'll do is, before I go into the rights of nature discourse, I just want to say one quick thing, that my entire aesthetic oeuvre could be expressed in really one single word, and that word is non-human, with a parenthesis around it. So what I've been studying is, both as an artist as well as a writer, is that relationship that exists within the non-human communities and the relationship the human communities make with the non-human communities. That image is responding to a very tragic history in a tragic episode in Siberia's history, but I can tell you that later on. So moving on to the idea of rights of nature. Earlier this morning, the questions came up about the origin of some of this. And the rights of nature that we have been discussing since this morning and in this exhibition is what I would call the second major invocation of that phrase. This is not the first time. And in fact, my work actually exists in that minefield of the conflict that exists between these two major invocations. The first invocation, that's why the title of my talk was Rights of Nature Says Who. The first invocation was articulated in a book called The Rights of Nature, a history of environmental ethics by distinguished environmental historian Roderick Nash. And it's a really seminal book. Nash lays out centuries of intellectual evolution in religious studies, in philosophy, in science, going all the way back to the Romans. And the Romans did have the concept of rights of nature, jus animalium. Nash points out that a significant part of the foundational work that went into what eventually was called rights of nature was actually done right here in Britain during the 18th and 19th century. Henry Short was a key figure who wrote a book, a very important book, Animals as Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress, first published in 1891 and still in print today. And he was also the first biographer of Henry David Thoreau and the first person who popularized Thoreau's work. So it makes perfect sense to have this rights of nature exhibition and the conference right here in the UK, right here in a UK institution. But what does rights of nature mean? Nash tells us, based on his reading of the history of environmental ethics, that, quote, this is Nash's words, nature has intrinsic value and consequently possesses at least the right to exist. This position, sometimes called biocentrism, ecological egalitarianism, or deep ecology, and it accords nature ethical status at least equal to that of the humans, unquote. In fact, many of the names that were brought up earlier in the morning, Thomas Berry, Professor Christopher Stone, Aldo Leopold, all of their work has gone into this conception of rights of nature. Moving on, so that book came out in 1989. That very same year that Nash's book was published, eminent Indian sociologist and historian Ramachandra Guha wrote a combative essay, Radical American Environmentalism and Wilderness Preservation, a third world critique, first published in the journal Environmental Ethics and later widely anthologized. I should actually say at this point that I live, although I come from India, I live and work in the United States. So some of the things that I'm sharing with you is from the history of the United States environmentalism, just to kind of clarify that. Guha writes, the quote, social consequences of putting deep ecology, which is basically these rights of nature, into practice on a worldwide basis, what its practitioners are aiming for are very grave indeed, Guha feared. Guha further points out two key issues that the deep ecologists have remained silent about and what he thought are the key drivers of ecological destruction: overconsumption and growing militarization. By, quote, invoking the boogie of anthropocentrism is at best irrelevant and at worst a dangerous obfuscation, Guha charged. A few years later, he introduced environmentalism of the poor, a radical notion at the time, at a conference in Ecuador. He presented it in part as a protest against what he had perceived to be an arrogant and false belief held by many American environmentalists that poor people couldn't afford to be environmental. The, quote, consequences that the societies of the third world are too poor to be green shall not go undisputed, unquote, Guha wrote. So the rights of nature, that ethic, and the environmentalism of the poor, which I call a practice, have remained adversaries ever since. As you can see, the rights of nature that is being invoked here in Nottingham cannot be exactly same as the one that Nash had discussed, which really evolved over several centuries of deep thinking. Because at this exhibition and the conference, survival concerns of the indigenous people and their land use practices make a strong presence that was absent from the first invocation of the phrase. It was by design, though, as any invocation of habitability and sustainable land use practices by indigenous cultures on wilderness-worthy land would have forced of some form of anthropocentrism or nature providing for humans, which was not possible as it was already thrown under the bus by the practitioners of American deep ecology. Both instances of rights of nature are very important, however. The question I've been asking is this: can these two diametrically opposed poles of environmentalism, the rights of nature ethic, environment of the market, the question is, can these two coexist? And the answer is yes. And we can get there at least by one way that I have been calling long environmentalism, which simply means an environment that has lasted for a while, and I have been sort of saying, say 25 years, which is intergenerational. I'm currently writing an essay on long environmentalism for a Routledge forthcoming anthology. For varieties of reasons, this photograph after the listening session which I made in 2006 was likely beyond the radar screen of most American environmental scholars in 1989 when Nash's Rights of Nature was published. The picture shows, by the way, as any photography historian will tell you, photographs don't tell the truth. This picture is not telling you the truth. These are not a bunch of happy people, but totally a group of pissed off individuals. But that's another story I'll tell you. They're all my friends, by the way. The picture shows Inupiat and Gwich'in cultural activists from Arctic Alaska, as well as environmentalists and scientists. It is a window into long environmentalism, and there are two braids in it. One involves the Inupiat and the other the Gwich'in, two indigenous communities of Arctic Alaska. I'll primarily discuss the latter braid, which constitutes the bulk of the photograph that you see in the exhibition here. Let me begin with a concrete example, Gwich'in caribou hunt. One of the intellectual reactions that may result from this particular image is that the photographer has fallen into the familiar trope of the ecological Indian. But the picture shows snowmobiles, gun, petrol cans, and even the clothing are a combination of traditional and modern. So this cannot be about ecological Indian, as that phrase has come to mean. In his historic 1988 testimony before the United States Congress, Gwich'in elder and cultural activist Jonathan Solomon said, quote, "Make no mistake, this is our life at stake here, the life of a modern hunting culture that is alive and healthy and growing," unquote. The emphasis is on modern hunting. The suite of caribou butchering photographs that you will see here in the exhibition is addressing the problem and is an attempt to decolonize American environmentalism. The public reactions about these images have been equally unsupportive. In 2005, the United Nations Environment Program gave me the Greenleaf Artist Award. But in 2009, when these images were shown in an exhibition in Copenhagen during the 2009 UN Climate Conference COP15, a UNEP representative from Nairobi, who is from Canada, no disrespect to Canadians, by the way, Joe and Jenna, no disrespect to Canadian, told me, quote, I'm paraphrasing her, "I wish you had not shown these photos here in Copenhagen. The post-domestic culture has gotten used to purchasing meat neatly packaged in plastic that seeing blood in meat has become disturbing for many." The suite of caribou butchering photographs is also addressing a philosophical problem and is an attempt to recognize where our food comes from. T.J. Demos had specifically asked me to address geo-symptoms. If I understand the phrase correctly, then a geo-symptom can at times address the presence of something and at other times about the absence and at times both. Geo-symptoms frequently appear in my work through tracks and traces, as you will see the image in the exhibition, caribou tracks on coal seams. But I'll speak about this particular image. Shinjek River 2 is not about a beautiful or simply about a beautiful snow-covered Arctic river valley. When you go look at that photograph, notice here, you will see a track going from the lower left to from southwest to northeast, roughly about a 45-degree angle. Ecology is making a mark on geology and challenging the pro-development rhetoric from various US lawmakers that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a, quote, frozen wasteland of snow and ice, unquote, quote, barren wasteland, unquote, and the most egregious one, quote, a flat white nothingness, unquote. But Shinjek River 2 is also about absence. In 1956, renowned mammalogist Dr. Olaus Murie, with his wife, renowned conservationist Margaret Murie, led the now famous Murie expedition into the Shinjek River Valley. They were pretty much sitting on the same place that you saw the previous photograph. Into the, where was I? Okay. And it was in that region, the hard work of the Muries and their colleagues led to the establishment of the Arctic National Wildlife Range in 1960, which was later expanded and renamed Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in 1980. On 6 December 1960, the United States Secretary of Interior, Fred Seaton, signed a public land order establishing the Arctic National Wildlife Range for, quote, the purpose of preserving unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values, unquote. Nowhere in this public land order do we find names of Gwich'in and Inupiat communities who have inhabited this region for many millennia and call the refuge home. Internationally known Gwich'in cultural activist Sarah James, who had accompanied me to Copenhagen for the COP15 summit, once showed me a hand-drawn map of the Shinjek River Valley with various Gwich'in family camps marked, and lamented the fact that that particular history of Gwich'in habitation along the Shinjek was wiped clean when the Arctic National Wildlife Range was established. She also made a rather explosive statement, quote, "I learned by living out in the wilderness," unquote, which I interpreted to mean that it complicates the wilderness philosophy in America by injecting justice into it, as the American wilderness does not allow human habitation or sustainable harvest of biotic resources from the land for survival. Shinjek River too is both presence of biotic life and absence of cultural habitation in a particular geography. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern Alaska is an international ecological treasure and is considered to be one of the most biodiverse conservation areas in the circumpolar north. Think of the Yasuni National Park. This is the Yasuni of the entire Arctic. In early June, the famed Porcupine River caribou herd calved on its coastal plain. The refuge has also nutritionally and spiritually sustained two indigenous communities for many millennia: the Gwich'in, who live on the south side of the Brooks Range Mountain, and the Inupiat, who live along the Arctic coast of Alaska. But in the late 1960s, since oil was discovered in Arctic Alaska in the late 1960s, there have been proposals, many proposals, to open up the Arctic refuge to drilling for oil, all of which have been defeated so far, and the refuge continues to remain free of industrial development. The campaign to create and then protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from oil and gas development has been going on for 6 decades. It is one of the longest running environmental engagement on Earth. I have been a character in it for the last 15 years. The environmentalists and the Gwich'in continue to collaborate on protecting the refuge from industrial destruction, although their respective reasons for doing so is quite different. One leans toward rights of nature ethic, and the other toward environmentalism of the marginalized practice. Now imagine, can you imagine putting a petrol pump in the homeland of this caribou? Yes, BP, Shell, they can imagine such a horrendous thing. So have the curators of Rights of Nature exhibition. We finally come to, I love that sculpture, and I could not have imagined a better juxtaposition of my image with anything else, so this is absolutely perfect. We finally come to where rights of nature meets environmentalism of the marginalized. The juxtaposition here, in this space it is presented slightly differently, but I usually present like this. The juxtaposition raises at least 3 different kinds of aesthetic tensions. Scale: to see a large image, we pull back, and to see a small image, we go near. Content: we feel attraction toward the migrating caribou and repulsion toward butchering. History: we feel compelled to preserve a pristine wilderness untouched by man, where caribou have walked since time immemorial, but man has lived in that wilderness also since time immemorial and have depended on the caribou for survival. I'll say a few words about earth law as it relates to my practice. You may already know that there are several what could be called earth laws or nature laws in existence in the United States, including the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. If nature is given rights in a juridical sense, then how would it exercise those rights? Philosophers have given us at least one answer: by using a guardian or trustee framework where humans become the trustees. Of course, this has been debated very heavily in the philosophical community. Nevertheless, earth law comes in the second braid of my photograph, this after the listening session, and it's about shales drilling in the Arctic Ocean of Alaska, the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, considered to be perhaps the most dangerous form of drilling anywhere on Earth, because no one knows how to clean up oil from underneath the frozen ice of the broken ice of the Arctic Ocean in the most harshest environment on this planet. I addressed that campaign primarily through writing. Okay, where was I? Chakchisiwa, Arctic Alaska, that the traditional members of the Inupiat communities and the environmentalists have been fighting to stop, curb, or slow down. I addressed that campaign primarily through writing and less through images, although the two breads are connected as well, and takes me back to the early days of my Arctic photography. This is also about non-human, as the bear is approaching a whalebone left behind from the previous year's hunt by the Inupiat people. On March 19th, nearly 2 years later after this image was taken, on March 19th, 2001, Senator Barbara Boxer displays a poster-sized version of the polar bear on Bernard Herbert photograph on the United States Senate floor to make a case against, by the way, that photo was along the Beaufort Sea coast, exactly where Shell wants to drill for oil. So Senator Barbara Boxer used that image on the US Senate floor to make a case against oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Her passionate plea helped secure a win for the conservationists that day, barely though, 52 to 48 vote, much to the dismay of the Bush administration. Senator Boxer's showing of my photograph, however, led to the censorship of my exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution, which later became the subject of a Senate hearing and finally a Senate investigation. I was also called effectively a liar by a very influential US Senator on the US Senate floor. The bear photograph, though, to use a contemporary slang, went viral and has since become one of the most published photographs in the history of the medium of photography, thanks to the Associated Press, who has been circulating that image all over the world without my permission or any remuneration to me. But I have no complaints against that. America's Arctic seas were calm, politically speaking, when President George W. Bush took office in 2001. But all that changed quickly. First the Bush and then the Obama administration exhibited unwise rush to exploit the Arctic seas for oil and gas. In doing so, the US government disregarded several nature laws, including the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and outright violated the National Environmental Policy Act. The only way we are winning so far on several cases that we have defeated the government and Shell is by invoking earth laws or nature laws on the ground, and we again won last year, on the ground that the US government has violated the National Environment Policy Act. I just wrote a kind of a detailed history of that. It's coming out in a US newspaper's Sunday magazine very soon. I want to wrap this, okay, I just want to, do I have maybe a couple more minutes or no? I should wrap up. Can I just say a couple more things? 2 minutes, okay, great. Let me just quickly go into, okay, I should have shown that. Just a little bit more on the Geo-Symptoms. In the known and unknown tracks, Geo-Symptoms and Earth Law came together to justify rights of nature. When I shared this photograph with environmental groups, it instantly raised a controversy. To the Inupiat and the environmentalists, the faint Caribou tracks, which you don't see clearly, were well known. But what about those bold linear tracks? With some research, it was discovered that they are the imprints left behind by heavy 3D seismic exploration vehicle, but no oil company should have had permits to explore this protected northeast section of the Tashapak Lake special area with such vehicles. The photograph was used in the Save Tashapak Lake campaign to oppose oil and gas development in this wetland, which is, by the way, the largest wetland complex in the entire Arctic. When the Bush administration granted permission to open up the area for oil and gas development, the conservation community, in partnership with the Inupiat, filed a lawsuit against the US Department of Interior. In September 2006, the US District Court of Alaska ruled in favor of the plaintiffs on the grounds that the government had not done appropriate ecological studies and did not make a persuasive case that development would ensure safety for the sensitive ecology and the way of life of the Inupiat, who depend on the wetland. While the bold tracks may give the impression that it would come to dominate that particular geography, but in the end, in this instant, it was the faint tracks that prevailed. In Caribou tracks on coal seams that you see in the exhibition, ecology makes a different claim on geology than the usual commercial exploitation. The Western Arctic caribou herd, the largest caribou herd in Alaska with nearly 380,000 animals, on which 40 different communities from 3 different tribes depend on, made these deeply etched tracks on the coal seams during their annual migrations, likely over many centuries or even millennia. As the image shows, the coal is right on the surface, and any development there will likely employ the ecologically devastating practice known as mountaintop removal. There is an estimated 4 trillion tons of bituminous coal in this place, which translates to about 4,000 years of coal burning at the current rate of US national consumption. I'm just wrapping it up, yeah. While coal is difficult and heavy to transport, there have been past and present proposals to develop this area for coal, and as the Arctic sea ice continues to melt, the transportation of resources and goods to the top of the earth becomes a reality. It is conceivable that there will be much pressure to develop all that Arctic coal. I want to just wrap this up by saying that a lot of work on art and environmental humanities need to get done before the two conceptions of rights of nature can be reconciled and build what we may call an egalitarian ecocentrism that accommodates concerns of the global north and the south. This exhibition and all the public programs, including this conference, I'm certain will contribute significantly towards such an effort. Thank you.
Hi, and thanks very much for this awesome invitation. Usually I'm kind of the odd one out when I speak about this new project, but here it's really embedded in such a strong discourse. I'm going to speak about forest law, which is the project that is also up in the exhibition. And as we've seen, rights of nature in the case of Ecuador is not wishful thinking, it's a legal reality. And it's this new constitution that was signed in 2008 was the result of various indigenous uprisings in the 80s and 90s, which led to a new government with much stronger indigenous political and juridical representatives who had then inscribed their ways of thinking and living in their constitution. And what's new and extraordinary is that it includes ecosystems, living forests, mountains, rivers, and so on, as legal subjects with, bearing rights. And the first article of these 5 laws that were created in this new constitution says, nature has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regenerations of its vital cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. So it's a very wide, very broad concept that it starts with. In the events, and I think that is what's really important here, is that if these rights are violated in any form, these newly declared juridical subjects may be defended in court by a person or a group. So for native communities who entirely depend on the forest for their livelihood, these laws, if they're enforced, can really guarantee their own survival. What is interesting is that with these new laws, Ecuador extends its jurisdiction to a multi-species population. And by doing so, it unhinges a human-centric legal conception and places them in a wider cosmopolitical context. As Cormac said, subjectivity is not in us, in humanity. It is a function that can be assumed and can be found anywhere. So indigenous nations in the Amazon speak of the living forest, selva viviente, which is a concept that not only concerns the life and reproductions of scientifically known species, but also living forest ecosystems, including vital but imperceptible beings like the master of the forests, of the rivers, the Amasanga, the Sacharuna, the Yashingu, who are vital and imperceptible, and they are the protectors of the forest and who keep the ecosystems alive. So this way of living and thinking with the forest comes under great pressure now from extractivist desires for oil and minerals, because there are these giant drilling and mining operations that are heavily weighing down on this extraordinarily biodiverse region. So since most of these territories are owned by indigenous nations, these are bound to create a lot of conflict and resistance. Forest law is a collaborative project with Brazilian architect Paulo Tavares, whose long-term research in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in the Amazon at large, is really the basis for this common field study that we did together in the Amazon, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and the project comprises of a series of photo text panels of newly designed maps, a synchronized two-channel video installation, and an artist book. So we feel that the complexity of the situation cannot be represented from a single hegemonic perspective. And we hope that through these multi-perspective vectors, the project engages with the deep embroilment of past and present geopolitics, with the living forest, and with the aesthetic and narrative means through which the constant advancement into the Amazon has been impelled. The process of extracting resources from the ground and transferring them to the global market, making them exchangeable, also extracts them from social and natural histories of where they come from, and of which they are part, like labor, migration, consumed environments, etc. The extraction from local ecologies is closely linked to the problem of how we tell stories of commodities and where they come from. Forest law concentrates on 3 landmark legal cases where the forest is brought to court. The project takes a slow road in trying to understand the ecological and cosmopolitical dimension of these paradigmatic trials on behalf of the forest and its people. One such case has been brewing in Shuar territories. This is actually so not well sequenced, these stills. The new case that is brewing now in the Shuar territories is in the south of Ecuador, where there is a huge Chinese copper mining project that is just about to just opened the territory for this. It's enclosing on indigenous lands. Another unresolved case resonates through the film like as a haunting memory of this large-scale contamination of soils and water caused by Texaco in the 70s. We're not expanding on that case in the film, but it comes up in the form of a mute forensic performance unearthing this smelly nightmare. At the heart of the project, however, lies the case of Sarayaku. It's a Quechua people who owns a large territory of forest that can be entered only through the river or by arriving on a small propeller plane. They sued the state. Here's the leader of the Sarayaku people whom we interviewed. They sued the state of Ecuador at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for intruding into their space and open it for oil exploration. A foreign company came and laid out the seismic lines across the land to form a deadly grid of buried explosives in the rainforest. Here you see the map of Samane Moafi and Paulo Tavares showing these overlapping jurisdictions. Showing the white line is the Sarayaku territory, and the yellow outline is the oil block that is designed. So it overlaps about to 2/3 of the oil block is on Sarayaku territory. What was particularly appalling to the Sarayaku people is that they targeted a forest area that is meant for the reproduction of animal species. They have organized the forest into hunting zones, fishing zones, and reserves, which they consider the living forest, where they hardly ever go themselves. The map doesn't simply operate as representation. Satellite technology is no longer used only as a top-down power instrument by states and corporations. NGOs and indigenous groups are increasingly using these mapping technologies as evidentiary material. So the earth bears signs that can be interpreted and used in court. Forest Law the project joins these efforts. Paolo could speak really at length about this because he was part of the Forensic Architecture research project, and I'm sorry he cannot be here today. So Sarayaku elders spoke up during the public hearings at the Inter-American Court and claimed that if the forest disappears, they too will vanish, because the destruction of the jungle erases the soul. What makes this case so important is that it involves the intersection of human rights and the rights of nature as two profoundly entangled realms. After a decade of struggle, Sarayaku won the case. The judges condemned the Ecuadorian state for violating the rights of communal property. This verdict confirmed that when traditional lands are involved, the rights to property has become the court's standing ruling on indigenous rights. Legal scholars consider this a problem because domestic and international law grants states a lot of leeway to interfere with property. Instead, they propose to situate the case more firmly in the regimes of international human rights. For now, there seem to be no other option, since the Inter-American Court doesn't take rights of nature into consideration. Forest law pursues a third route. Placed in the context of the anthropogenic Amazon and planetary climate change, the project sees the groundbreaking legal cases unfolding in the Amazon as an opportunity to consider an important legal potential that lies beyond both property rights and human-centric laws. The video prologue evokes the Earth as a living planet whose surface has evolved into ecosystems that keep her metabolism alive. A 4-degree rise of temperature would be enough to disable the Amazon ecosystem and turn it into dry scrub. With this important cooling system shut down, the planet turns increasingly hot and dry, with ever-shrinking land left for human food production. When the forest is gone, world civilization will have come to an end. In other words, what unfolds in this remote corner of the rainforest is of worldly importance. What moves to the foreground of our intellectual attention are the most material concerns. Toxic wastes that are spilled out after extraction and remain a jarring presence in the equatorial forest 30 years later come under forensic scrutiny before forest law. Let me see, no, I don't have that one. No longer the passive backdrop to human history, the landscape, nature, and matter itself turns to the fore and becomes the subject of this aesthetic examination. The evidence brought to the surface speaks of the perishing of worlds, of life worlds, with whom the law has no relationship. Nature, and hence life forms and their ecologies, are treated by the world legal system as mere property to be traded, consumed, and at best protected by environmental laws imposing regulations on corporate and private actors. The recognition of natural communities bearing equal rights of existence is only just rising over the legal horizon. While we have parceled off the land into small cells that can be owned and exploited, entire living systems of the earth are illegally invisible. The two synchronized videos in their stereo optic expose a landscape that is populated by all kinds of sentient beings who inhabit different dimensions of reality, minute copper deposits, forest spirits, indigenous councils, scientists, medicinal plants, international law, global oil corporations, river systems. By addressing this complex ecology of practices, forest law delves into cosmopolitical considerations, the politics of humans and of everything else. The shift from worldly to cosmic politics raises the question of how do law, ecology, and cosmology conceive of the global, the cosmos, of something common to go by. If realism has made us see that reality is something that needs to be built rather than something already there, we can assume that the common world, too, needs to be made, not just represented. Forest law contributes to this endeavor by tying local ecologies to an entity that Ursula calls environmental world citizenship, where rights of nature are brought in contact with the kind of thinking that has emerged from years of developing a practice of global social connectedness. Thank you.
Next and last for this panel is the Otolith group. So I invite Kojo Eshun and Angelica Segar to give their presentation. Thank you.
I hope some of you had a chance to see Medium Earth, the film we made last year, which is showing in the show Rights of Nature. And this text we prepared for this occasion is a kind of sequel to some aspects of Medium Earth. So we'd like to thank Alex and TJ for inviting us. We're very happy to be here in the company of Ursula, Subhankar, and so many scholars and artists whose work we admire and whose work we've learnt from. And without further ado, we're going to begin. Just to say briefly, what you see behind you is images from an archive, an informal archive that we gathered from the United States Geological Survey in Pasadena. It's an archive of unofficial earthquake predictions, which is what Medium Earth is about, and it's what we're going to develop in this short presentation. Okay. Anjali, do you want to say anything?
Yes, I mean, I think what we are interested in here is the concept of geo kind of symptomology. So, and we can perhaps talk about that a bit later when we sit as a panel.
Okay, so we'll begin. This is called Night Search for Four Voices. Okay. Welcome to Night Search. It's 7 p.m. on March 2nd, 2013. I'm Eddie Middleton, here in Memphis. Justin Abner is up in Pigeon Forks, Tennessee, and we're interviewing Charlotte King tonight. She's a famous biological sensitive who has been able to predict earthquakes quite accurately, and she has amazing abilities to pick up on frequencies that most people can't experience. Charlotte, I know you do a lot of other things that you're noted for, but I guess the main thing is the earthquake predictions. And so just to start out, I want to welcome you to Night Search and ask you maybe to fill in a little bit about your background, how you got started with this kind of earthquake prediction thing. So our listeners who maybe are not familiar with you know something about, your background.
Thank you, Eddie. So, in 1981, 1980, I should say, I connected with the mountain when here in California, when St. Helens started getting active. I started getting really bad headaches, which actually started back in about 1979. And I didn't know why, and they, did tests and stuff, and everything was fine medically. So I basically just had thousands, sorry, Eddie. So I basically just had headaches all the time, migraines, and nobody knew what it was. I was seeing specialists and given medication and stuff. Nothing would help. And when they first had the first earthquake on St. Helens in March the 16th of 1980, it felt like my head was going to blow up. And then when the volcano had its first earthquake, the pain subsided just briefly, and I said, it's the volcano. And from that point on, I was locked into Mount St. Helens, and I still am. I can feel it from anywhere, from where I am now, 90 miles away, to when I was in Colorado, over almost 2,000 miles away or more. So it's just, it's really just a connection with the earth. And what really put it all together for me was that in 1979 was the beaching of the whales here in Oregon. There were a series of sound changes that woke me up from a sound sleep. No pun intended, and I was really scared. I didn't know why. I started crying. I called the television station up in Portland that I was reporting information to, and they said nothing was happening. And then that evening, about 4 hours after the call, they interrupted the television station to talk about a series of sperm whales that were beaching on the Oregon coast. And in all, 41 beautiful giant mammals beached and died. And when the sound changed, they beached. And then 4 days later, 3 to 4 days later, there were 4 moderate earthquakes in Big Bear, California. And it just all clicked for me at that point. I knew that I was feeling earthquakes, at least in the United States. I didn't know too much about other areas yet. And as time progressed, I not only had sound changes, but I also have physical symptoms. And each part of my body is tied to a different geographical location. And I'm not unique in this. The only unique thing was that I was able to put it together, because there are hundreds and thousands and even maybe hundreds of thousands of people out there that feel these things. They just don't know what they're feeling. And some can hear things, and some can feel things, and some do both, and very few do both. Most of the people that hear it in the higher frequency, whereas I hear it in the subsonic sound level, which most people do not, although there are a couple of people that do. And it doesn't matter if you're in Oregon, Tennessee, or in Wyoming, or in Japan, or China, or Chile. It doesn't make any difference. The sounds and the symptoms are always the same, and that way you can identify where the next event is going to take place.
So let me ask you, Charlotte, although of course the tsunami that hit Japan a couple of years ago and destroyed the Fukushima nuclear reactor, did you pick up on that?
That's right, Eddie. Oh, absolutely. There were about 3 days of precursor activity for that. Japan is always left shoulder blade pain. And if it's over a 6, which obviously this was, it's a sharp, jabby heart pain on the left side of the chest. It feels like a knife is just going in and out, sharp little jabbles. And that's quite uncomfortable, but not severe. And also, animals react to Japan if it's over a 6. Cats start vomiting. Mostly it's fur balls, but after a while, it's not even fur balls. And when you have one cat that throws up a fur ball, as you know, that's not a big deal. But when you have all of your cats doing it at the same time, then it's a big deal. I also have ants that I keep very close watch on. They're kind of my backup precursor group here. And before the quake in Japan, they were climbing the wall in droves, literally thousands of them, and up over the ceiling. They did not want to be in the ground at all. And the morning of the earthquake, I went to go to work, and I was still working at that time. When I opened the garage door, and the whole driveway, well, I will not say the whole driveway, I like to think the whole driveway was coated, but the whole driveway surface was littered with dozens of them, earthworms that had crawled out of the ground. And I said, uh-oh, and I went back to work, and I had to move a bunch of them before I could back my car out. And I went on to work, and then when I got to work and parked the car, I was still sitting there trying to assimilate what I'd seen, and I knew what was going to happen. And I went upstairs to the office, and there were 4 steps going up that are concrete. And when you have that landing to go into the door, well, the earthworms had climbed those 4 concrete stairs, and there were still some on the bottom steps. And they had made it all the way to the top landing, and they were laying all over the landing up there just to get away from the ground. And that's when I got my permission to go out in my car, get my laptop out, and send out an alert for Japan.
And that happened a day or 2 later, or what?
No, just a few hours.
Okay.
I had put put the alert out. I had already been putting the alert out to my group for several days. But to pay, you know, Japan was really doing something. But this was a heads up, you know, kind of a warning shot that I send out, you know, we're in a timeline now. Something's going to happen within the next 12 hours or less.
So I've got to ask you this. I know you've been doing earthquake predictions based on these kind of biological symptoms since what, 1980 or
1979.
And how accurate have you been, if you don't mind talking about your track record of success to date?
Oh, no, not at all. Obviously, I've not been 100%. Some of the great big ones that I felt were going to happen were maybe a day or two late. There's been 3 or 4 times that I've missed one, but then the precursors continued, and then it did show up. So it wasn't that it didn't happen. The precursors that I watched continued to happen, so it moved the timeline out accordingly. And my group knows how that works. So, but it's just each time you have an event, you move the timeline out another day or two, beyond what the timeline was originally set on. And it's kind of hard to explain, but anyway, that's what I do. And I'm always ahead of time. You know, the timeline when it's going to be Mount St. Helens, I'm 100%, Japan, I'm 100%, Mexico, I'm 100%, Oregon, I'm 100%, Chile, I'm definitely 100%. And there's, you know, you can miss some.
Charlotte, can you tell us, is there anything right now going on precursors that would indicate some major quake in some place in the world that you could tell us?
Well, we're expecting, Oregon's stirring up a little bit because the vision's getting really bad, and Oregon is always vision. And I'm not concerned. It's just probably an aftershock to the 5.1 we had a couple of days ago. And left lower ribs on back are hurting again. That's Oceania, probably New Zealand, Australia, in that area because they're due. They're also due for an aftershock that's the area that's been really uncomfortable later. And my right knee and hip and leg have been hurting. That's Peru, Brazil, Colombia.
Okay, handing over to Justin now.
Okay, Justin Abner here in Pigeon Forks, Tennessee. I just wanted to bring in our second guest who's been waiting patiently all this time over in the Pacific Palisades. Professor Theodore Adorno, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Great. Now I understand that you've been conducting up to the minute content analysis of the 3 months of the daily column, Astrological Forecasts by Carol Reiter in the Los Angeles Times from November 1952 to February 1953. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
As I understand that this is a brand new research that you have just completed, can you share some of your findings with us?
Our social system, in spite of its closeness and the ingenuity of its technical functioning, seems actually to move towards self-destruction. The sense of an underlying crisis has never disappeared since the First World War, and most people realize, at least dimly, that the continuity of the social process and somehow of their own capacity of reproducing their own life is no longer due to supposedly normal economic processes, but to factors such as universal rearmament, which by themselves breed destruction while they are apparently the only means of self-perpetuation. This sense of threat is real enough, and some of its expressions, such as the A and H bombs, are about to outrun the wildest neurotic fears and destructive fantasies. The more people profess official optimism, the more profoundly they are probably affected by this mood of doom. The idea, correct or erroneous, that the present state of affairs somehow must lead towards a total explosion, and that the individual can do very little about it. The sense of doom may today obtain a peculiar sinister coloring by the fact that the present form of social existence seems to go down, whereas no new and higher form of social organization appears on the horizon. The wave of the future seems to consummate the very fears that are produced by the conditions of the present. Astrology takes care of this mood by translating it into a pseudo-rational form, thus somehow localizing free-floating anxieties in some definite symbolism, but it also gives some vague and diffused comfort by making the senseless appear as though it had some hidden and grandiose sense, while at the same time corroborating that this sense can neither be sought in the realm of the human, nor can probably be grasped by humans. the combination of the realistic and the irrational in astrology may ultimately be accounted for by the fact it represents a threat and a remedy in one, just as certain psychotics may start a fire and at the same time prepare for its extinction.
So if I interpret you correctly, Professor, you seem to believe that the cult of God has been replaced by the cult of facts, just as the fatal entities of astrology, the stars, are themselves viewed as facts, things ruled by mechanical laws.
That is correct. One could not grasp the specificity of astrology and of the whole frame of mind it stands for if one would simply call it a reversion to older states of metaphysics. What it's characteristic of is the transfiguration of a world of things into quasi-metaphysical powers. Auguste Comte's postulate that positivism should become a kind of religion is fulfilled ironically. Science is hypostasized as an ultimate absolute truth.
I would like to throw that back to Charlotte King, who is in the studio with Eddie Middleton. While you've been looking at how people look at the stars, Charlotte's been listening into the earth. Charlotte, can you hear me? I can hear you just fine, Justin. Great. So my next question would be like, do you predict like any major events coming soon? Eddie may have asked a question about that already in regards to solar flares or any. Well, it's hard to answer because I'm in a timeline. I've moved the timeline out several days for another bigger event again. I haven't seen the major precursor that I'm watching for yet. Once I see that, I'll put a heads up.
Okay.
It's kind of in a 3-day timeline right now, but I am watching for another, the final precursor to show up before I can actually put a heads up on it. Like I said before, I'm really feeling Peru, Brazil, Colombia. That's the right leg. If it gets into the left leg, then you have to watch out for Ecuador. Watching for Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the Kermadec Islands. If it's New Zealand, it could be North or South Island or even Christchurch. Those are the main areas that I pick up on. I think Oregon is always vision. As you can see, fine, but everything is blurry. Your depth of perception is off. So if you're trying to read something, you can put it next to your face or 10 inches away, and you still can't read it. Even though you can read it, you can't. It's just blurred. And other people are picking up on Chile, so things are still moving around.
So, well, look, we could even talk about this, but I think you said some people had committed suicide before major quakes occurred.
Oh, Chile.
Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Sure. That's a term I've coined, the Chile connection. And Chile is very different. Chile affects the left eye, the left side of your face. It feels, well, I call it feeling disconnected because it isn't like it doesn't really belong to you. It's like everything's off a little bit. And you actually get neuralgia, often in your face itself, on the skin. It's sore. It hurts to blink your eye. And sometimes there's a headache with Chile. There's never usually chest pain with Chile, though what happened with Chile is an emotional thing. It's instantaneous, anger for no reason, road rage, domestic violence escalates, suicides escalate, shootings, murders, mass murders, even terrorist attacks. All of these things tend to precede Chile's earthquakes. And I don't really know exactly why, except that I know it's a particular frequency that affects the brain in some way. And it's Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. I always tell people when I send out my emails, pay attention to the railroad crossings, because for whatever reason, before earthquakes in Chile, people are always on the edge. That are going to commit suicide, that they feel like they're going to commit suicide. They choose it to do it by walking down railroad tracks, waiting for a train, walking towards a train on a railroad track, even lying down on the tracks, waiting for the train, or stepping in front of a train. We had over 35 fatalities here in Salem within about 3 years on the railroad tracks, here going through the town on a 5-mile stretch, and both Amtrak and Southern Pacific conductors and engineers were on those trains, and some of them more than once. And there was nothing that they could do because it takes 6 blocks to stop a train. And these people were seriously just lying there on the tracks, waiting for the train, or they would step in front of it, or in one instance, someone was walking down the train with another person, and they heard the whistle. They turned around, they looked at it, and they just kept on walking.
If you could just hold it there, Charlotte, we just have time to introduce our final guest on Night Search, Professor Bruno Latour, all the way over there in Edinburgh. He's taken time away from preparing for the 4th of his 6th Gifford Lectures at Edinburgh University, to be with us tonight. Professor Latour, are you there? Yes, I'm here. Great. I understand that you are about to deliver your 4th Gifford Lecture on the Anthropocene and the destruction of the image of the globe today at 2 p.m. on 25th February 2013. That is correct, yes. You've been listening to Charlotte all this time, have you not? Yes, I have. Indeed, I have. And what I want to say very briefly is this. It is our globe, our ideal idea of the globe, that should be destroyed for any work of art, any aesthetic to emerge. If you agree to hear in the word aesthetic its old meaning of being able to perceive and to be concerned, that is, a capacity to render oneself sensitive, a capacity that precedes any distinction between the instruments of science, of art, and of politics.
Justin here in Pigeon Forks, Tennessee, just following your words down there in Edinburgh, Professor. Charlotte, when you hear Bruno Latour talking about the capacity to render yourself sensitive, you are ahead of him in a sense. After all, you've been a sensitive since 1979, haven't you? Yes, I have. I'll get emails from people in Oregon or other places, and all of a sudden they say, Chile must be going on, because I have been angry all day at everything, or at my husband, or we are fighting. It must be Chile. And it is. It truly is. If you start getting angry and you don't know why, and there's no reason for it, you just have to look for an outside cause, and that's usually Chile. And suicides really, really escalate before Chile. In fact, I had 3 people that I know personally. 2 of them were good friends that knew all about Chile, and they both committed suicide before Chile earthquakes. And they had an Operation Lifesaver by our governor's task force here in Oregon. And they asked me to come in and speak to the group because I actually predicted 3 of the fatalities before they happened based on the Chile connection. And so they had come to me and to talk to me. And those fatalities, says Justin, happened on the railroad tracks. They preceded some of the quakes in Chile, every single one of them. Every fatality except one, where an 84-year-old lady fell on a track when she was crossing. They were followed by earthquakes in Chile, every single one of them. Amazing, Professor. Do you want to come back on that?
I have to go prepare for my 4th Gifford Lecture now. I would just like to emphasize that the capacity to render oneself sensitive precedes any distinction between the instruments of science, of art, and of politics.
Thank you for joining us, Professor Latour. We appreciate it. Now, Charlotte, did these suicides just occur in Chile with Chile earthquakes, or is that just earthquakes in general? Chile, and I don't know what it is. I don't know what the mechanism is that causes it, but I know that it is there, and it is really easy to see. All you have to do is go back and look at events that have taken place, and then go back and look at the reports on the archives at the USGS. And you know, the United States Geological Survey. And you can see Chile followed every one of those events.
They had a 9-point quake in Chile not too long ago, or am I mistaken?
Well, Eddie, 9.2, that was the biggest quake. And anybody has ever recorded, yeah, it was a 9.2. That was quite a few years back, I think. I don't really remember the exact date, but yeah, they did. It was a really big quake. I think it was the biggest one. Though there was one in Alaska, 1964, I think that was a bigger one, I'm not sure. We had Chile, Bolivia, and we had Alaska, Japan, have all been 9 or greater. Chile, the Chile Quake in 2010, that was 8.8, and I predicted that one. And that was the one I predicted to ABC television before it happened, and it hit 4 hours later.
Wow. Professor Adorno, you've been very patient over there in Pacific Palisades. Would you like to respond to anything Charlotte King has been saying? Yes, I would. The veiled tendency of society towards disaster lulls its victims in a false revelation with a hallucinated phenomenon. In vain they hope in its fragmented blatancy to look their total doom in the eye and withstand it. Panic breaks once again after millennia of enlightenment over humanity whose control of nature as control of men far exceeds in horror anything men ever had to fear from nature. Thank you, Professor. Lots to think about there. We appreciate you taking time away from your urgent work on your 10 theses on occultism to join us all on Night Search this evening. Charlotte, would you like to come back on anything Professor Adorno has said?
Chile, the Chile Quake in now 2010, now that was 8.8, and I predicted that one. That was the one I predicted to ABC television before it happened, and it hit 4 hours later. And that one is on YouTube. They actually put it out there on YouTube. And my interview that they did with me, that was on the news for 4 hours after the quake, within 4 hours of the quake. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe 3 questions or so. Ursula and Subhankar, do you want to join us on the panel? So I'd like to, again, pass around the mic for 3 questions right now. So are there any to begin with? There's one in the corner over here. The idea of the panel, I'll just say a couple words, was if rights of nature extend legal standing to non-human subjects, then how are non-human subjects expected to speak on their behalf? How are they expected to articulate their interests in courts of law? So the 3 very different presentations and speaking from very different artistic engagements, I think, speak to that question of speculating how non-human agents can possibly signify or produce forms of representation. So, yeah.
Thank you. What forms of energy production would the members of the panel, or indeed anyone who's spoken this morning or attending the conference, would like to see? For instance, would people rather have carbon-based energy production, or nuclear, fusion or fission, or renewables, so-called, including possibly carbon capture and storage, or biomass with its implication for land use? Secondly, but also in relation to this point, do people attending this conference want to see a cap or even reduction in population level? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Are there a couple more questions so that we could put several to the panel right now? Yep, Brian.
Yeah, it's a question for Subhankar. I'd like to hear you expand a little bit on in what way the long generational approach to ecology can bring together these seemingly opposing notions of a kind of untrammeled nature and nature independent from human activity and a sort of a recognition of the ways in which people are intimately dependent on, the interrelations of hunting and fishing and so on. I missed that understanding of the generational approach that you're suggesting.
Thank you. Any others for right now? Go ahead.
Is this? Oh, yeah, it's on. In what sort of? I mean, this is all an organic process, so maybe we can't spell it out. But what are some possible ways you can envisage the local struggles taking place, for example, in the Americas, with a sort of a need for international or sort of global movement, but in a way that doesn't undermine national development of countries in the South? It's a bit of a tricky question. I don't know if I expressed it nicely or not. But yeah, basically, in what practical ways can local struggles unite with global movements that doesn't undermine national development in the South? I think that's a better way of putting it.
Okay, thank you.
And that's good for everyone.
Who would like to? Was there one more? Yeah, please. The mic is coming to you right now.
Just a very quick question, just a very immediate response really to Kojo and Anjali's performance. And I wondered if they had anything to, what they had to say on questions of gendering and theory and questions of sensitivity. Yeah, that's the question.
Okay, great, thank you. Who would like to start? Subhankar.
I could first maybe respond to you, Brian. The thing is that in that first nature of rights of nature, the conception, the environmental ethic, the way it evolved, primarily has looked at essentially philosophy, religious studies, and science. And environmentalism in general, one area that has not been paid much attention to is actually anthropology, and particularly interpretive anthropology. So long environmentalism, essentially, I mean, it's a very early exploratory phase I'm at, is kind of looking at that. The reason for it is when we are talking about these big conceptions, our tendency is to come up with a global concept, meaning abstracting things out. And when we are doing that, toward actually some kind of a just system, we are actually undermining, comes back to your question about the local, is we are undermining at times these local complexities, because local is almost always far messier than the global. So one of the things of long environmentalism is that it's not that one conception is supplanting or even overriding the other, but an ability for these things to coexist. That's why I was using the word coexist. In the case of the very specific example of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge struggle, like I said, the Guichin conception and the environmentalist conception have really coexisted. And the Guichin part was not given to them by the environmentalists. They made a claim to that space by themselves by creating their organization. The whole 15 villages came together in 1988. Since that point, because the ultimate goal is to have this space protected, preserved, the sustainability of life goes on, whether it's a caribou or myriads of life. So it's essentially having this ability for these conflicting things that may seem conflicting can coexist at times. And so that's the idea. It isn't that these will supplant other or subsume the other. It's not like that. That is what I'm kind of exploring. So I'm a little bit skeptical about global theories a lot of the times because it tend to undermine the local. So keeping the local complexity in place is actually a good thing. And you had a question to it, but maybe someone else could answer the energy questions. So maybe I approach maybe a little bit of your local, address some of your local concerns or how local connects with global. National development. How, now you're talking, so there is the local issue, which is the complexity going on like in case of Ecuador, then comes the national politics of development, which may or may not conflict with that. Oftentimes, like in the Ecuador case and Bolivia, we are realizing it is conflicting. So then the local has a connection to the global, and they can reach out to international organizations. And that's taking place in many instances where the national politics is being challenged. That's happening in the US, but US, the problem is that challenging the national politics is almost impossible. For example, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge case, there has been many proposals to make that as a, let's say, UNESCO World Heritage Site. It would any day qualify for a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but even that discussion cannot come up in US politics because US will not allow that. So it is a very complicated question you're asking, that between the local connecting with the global justice, but then the national development politics comes in. It's complicated, but all three connections actually exist.
What your question in the back reminds me of is the differential politics and imperatives of environmental politics. So it means one thing to speak of, to try to assert degrowth economics in developed countries, but it means something entirely different to communities that are suffering from poverty or enforced impoverishment. So there needs to be a balance between what kind of environmental policies exist in different locations, depending on the levels of development and poverty alleviation. So I think that's what.
I'm really glad you brought it up. What like Amartya Sen called development as freedom. Yes, so development can be just, development can be sustainable. I'm glad you brought that up, right. I think I missed that point, right.
Other responses?
Well, maybe I could just add a point to this idea of development. In the case of Ecuador, the nation, presents interests in development that is not shared at all by the native communities. You'll see in the interview he's talking about that the state believes that they have to come and you know, realize large infrastructural projects, build roads, etc. They're not interested in that. They don't want any of this. But it's an idea that's imposed of the state, and it's declared as a development. So, you know, what development means is also for debate here. Yeah. And it's, but the problem is that the laws in Ecuador are one type of law for the surface, which is the indigenous rights of nature, is happening on that level, whereas on the ground there is another law that is of a national kind of law that relates to all geological wells. So these two laws happen, you know, are juxtaposed, and they, and you know, as Cormac said, when it's a matter of national interests, what is meant is always the economic interest. So these conflicting jurisdictions, you know, end up being won by the state most of the time. But as an aesthetic practice, as a cultural practice that I'm involved in, I think it's very important to link local ecologies, to the engagement with local ecologies, to something larger that we have learned so much about, done so much studies about through cultural studies in the global connectedness of society. And I think in ecological, the ecology movement has until recently been much more concerned with the local and kind of scared or weary about the global because it's so connected to the global economy. But I think it's really important in aesthetic terms to bring these two together.
Responding briefly to Roz's question about the relation between gender theory and sensitivity, the figure we focused on, Charlotte King, is maybe the best known out of a number of mostly American earthquake sensitives who we analyzed and got in touch with through most of 2013 and 2014. And you can see that the particular kind of bodily symptoms that she reads as kind of indicators to predictions give Charlotte King a certain kind of authority. So an entire syndrome of particular ailments, she talks about having solar flu. Particular kinds of flu, particular kinds of headaches, particular kinds of aches and pains constitute her as a kind of authority of reading her own symptoms, which enables her to constitute an entire community around her. So she takes on quite a large importance in these particular communities, and you join them by sending her an email, and she sends you these quake reports. They're like weather reports, except they're reports on her own weather as it relates to these kind of planetary perspectives. So I would say it's not so much a question of theory; it's more a question of a passionate conviction of her own relation to geography, to seismology, to tectonics, and to the body. And in a certain sense, it's something like a contemporary version of the medieval notion of mappa mundi. The map of the world is revisited upon one's body, and one takes upon oneself the ability to decode that. I think if one lives in areas of seismic incident, massive seismic incident, whether that's Iran or whether that's Pakistan or whether that's China or Turkey or Japan or certain parts of North America, it's certainly possible to gain some kind of attunement to that. And the question is then, if you then elaborate that to something like a Weltbild, a world picture, a cosmology, but a cosmology that is made out of scientific materials, but is clearly parascientific. I think it clearly, it's something that happens outside of science and it happens outside of forensics. And what's interesting for us is how a figure like Charlotte King operates in a kind of autodidact manner, so that she is something like a non-scientific attempt to come to terms with the scientific vocabulary that becomes available in the moment of impending catastrophe. So we could say that when infrastructure breaks down, whether that's a so-called natural disaster or so-called man-made disaster, all kinds of misunderstandings become available. And in the earthquake sensitives, you hear an elaborated form of misunderstanding, which is something elevated to something like a worldview.
I mean, in relation to, shamans and psychics and people who read the world in their way, many shamans who go through forms of trauma, nervous breakdown, and actually have an experience of being connected to the earth and this kind of sense of a kind of solid ground that's kind of falling to pieces. And I would say in the range of psychics and shamans that I've come across, there's quite an equal gender balance going on there. And also in terms of the contributors, as Kojo said, to the USGS archive.
Okay. It's profoundly unjust to cut the conversation off right now. But I've become very sensitive to the fact that we have a right to lunch, and we have to save some time. Before you go, I'd like to say that during lunch, in this room, we'll continue with Amy Balkin's reading of the IPCC report as a continuation of her performance. And there will also be representatives of radical science and anti-fracking in the Nottingham region at this desk, organizing and asking for people to sign their petition. So please come in the little time we have for lunch, and we'll start up at a little very soon after 2 o'clock. And I hope you definitely come back on time. We're going to start up with a presentation by Ariel Derringer, who joins us from Canada, and we'll be speaking about the politics of the tar sands. And then we'll have more panels with other artists included in the show. So thank you very much.